than 150 participants. So maybe good
Yes.
afternoon and good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you all the participants for joining the third interesting session. So we're going to have two sessions. Uh, the first session will be design and development by Chris, and the second will going to be uh, PIM software by Tracer. So maybe before we start, let me introduce our speakers. The first speaker will be Dr. Chris. Chris is actually the founder and the current chief executive officer and e-health director of Jambi Health System. Jambi Health System is actually a non-profit organization working on most of the time in developing countries in Africa and focusing on the development of e-health health information system. Chris is a digital health professional with a background in biomedical research, computer science, and also information system. After he completed a PhD in medical biochemistry at the University of Cape Town, he studied computer science and software engineering. At the same time, he established the Biomedical Informatics Research Division at the South African Medical Research Council. Chris is an elected fellow of the International Academy of Health Sciences Informatics. He is an honorary research associate at the University of Cape Town and also honorary associate professor in the School of Mathematics, Statistics, Computer Science at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. He has ample experience, so we're going to have a session with him as well. The second speaker will be Tracer. He has actively participated in the development of open HIM, the interoperability layer system built by Jambi. Tracer has recently worked on driving the design and implementation of DISI architecture to integrate electronic medical record system with the national DHIS2 server in Cameroon. He is currently working as the software developer team manager, managing 3 teams with 13 developers and team leaders in total. So we will have 2 different sessions. So let me invite the first speaker, Dr. Chris. As usual, participants, you leave your questions and comments in the chat box so that you will get a response based on the order you put your questions. I will leave the room to Dr. Chris, please. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction, and great to be being on this call, and thanks very much for the invitation. I will just test if I can share my screen. Thanks. Can I ask if my screen is visible in present mode?
Yes, it is. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thanks very much. Please stop me if I become inaudible. I'm connecting from a remote location. Can everyone hear me? Did I just get a sound check?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks very much. And great to be participating today. So I'm going to be giving the first part of the module presentation today, which is part of the Health Information Systems Project Management Toolkit and Training. And the module that we are particularly have been invited kindly by the University of Gondar to help deliver is the design and development module. So just skipping ahead to where that fits in the Health Information Systems Project Management Toolkit. This is the module number 3. So it fits in after the preparation phase and the development of the project charter and the overall project plan. So this is the beginning of module 3, the design and development phase. So the module overview, as I mentioned, it's technically part 4 of an 8-module series, and the audience is new health information system managers and teams. And the objective of this is to recognize the major design features of a project and how it will be developed. The learning outcomes, just as a reminder for this, are to recall the design and development of the Health Information Systems Project Management Toolkit, to identify the main components of design and the development phase, to demonstrate the HIS PM Toolkit design and development templates, and practice by applying the design and development approaches and techniques. Right, so moving on to the roadmap. During the session, we'll cover the project requirements gathering phase, and then the software requirements gathering processes. So those are the 2 sub-modules that I will be delivering, and then I'll be handing over to Trezor, who will continue with the next sections, which are the hardware requirements gathering processes, training and capacity building, policy compliance, security planning, and measuring the project success. Thanks. So I'm just going to skip forward to the introductory section. Okay, so this first section deals with the executive summary and the summary of the design and development phase. So the executive summary is a component. Sorry, is someone trying to speak? Okay, apologies for that. So the executive summary is developed at the beginning of this phase, and should include all of the important and relevant points in your plan. So it's really almost a contents or a roadmap that you develop right at the beginning of the phase, in order to envision and visualize what the overall process would be, and really revisit what the goals are and what all of the kind of artifacts and templates that one is trying to during this phase of the project. So it's important, it's useful to think of the absolutely crucial things that your management team needs to know when they open this document. So that all appears as a summary in the executive summary, summarizing the main points that have been achieved. And as I said, it's useful at the beginning to almost go through that as an exercise, which you can rewrite at the end again, the executive summary, once you finish the phase, but also to give off a good bird's eye view of what you're hoping to achieve, which can then be modified as you go along. So that the reader can actually see what they expect to see in the documentation before they have a chance to go into in any more detail. So also some of the stakeholders will not necessarily read the whole document in detail. So the executive summary should provide a good synopsis of what is included in the more detailed components of the plan. Also a very well articulated and coherent explanation of what is being planned. So, so that's the executive summary, followed by the introduction, which provides a background to the purpose of the project design and development phase and the project description. So this template to the right of yours describes or provides a useful template to list out those components at the beginning of the project. So as I mentioned, the executive summary with the project name, the software or product name, the project manager, project brief description, intended audience, and then the introduction. So the purpose of the project design and development plan and the project description. So moving on to the next slide, we talk here about the design and development phase and the purpose of the project design and development phase. And this phase comes before a project plan. And so it's an artifact that's developed at the beginning in order to envision and to specify the design and the development path that will be followed. The project key features are also included, including the ideas, processes, resources, structure, and criteria for success, and the major deliverables are planned out. So the purpose of the project design and development plan is to transform the requirements into complete and detailed system design specifications. And you'll see shortly that the process we go through is to articulate the requirements from different perspectives, and then to transform those, as mentioned there, into system design specifications. And these will then be used, obviously, for the downstream phases in the development life cycle. So this step helps to plan and functional project, and we'll go to those in a bit more detail. And then also one of the useful points to consider is that updating of documents and getting signed approvals may seem like a lot of work, but it is not as much work as trying to develop or implement a system that does not have any up-to-date documentation. So that really makes the point that it's very important to keep these documents up to date as you go through the project. We'll talk a little bit later about the agile development methodology, which really entrenches this view that you don't necessarily know everything up front at the beginning of a project, but you do the best you can, and then iterate through the development of that documentation. And as you go through the project and as the knowledge becomes apparent during the different phases. So, and an important part of that is to keep all stakeholders abreast of developments and changes as you move through the project, and have that baked into the documentation. So some of the time you may need to use your judgment as to what level of changes are required in an active version of the documentation, but anything which might have an impact on the timelines or the cost of the project should be documented as a change to the basic documentation. So as I mentioned, moving from planning to design and development, this transition should be iterative, meaning you will likely gather design requirements and need to update your project plan. So as you go along, you're starting off with an initial project and some initial plan ideas. And then as you move through design and develop, it's a little bit like a voyage of discovery, and the two phases are tightly interrelated. So the design and development phase builds off of the prepare and planning stages, and then at the same time informs them. And as a result, it may require the manager to go back and to update the plan documents. And as I mentioned, significant changes may require a new version, updated signatures, and of course, potentially updated estimation of things like project timelines. It's worth mentioning as well that what we know from project management best practice is that the mistakes made at the beginning of the project management lifecycle are likely to be more impactful the closer they are to the very beginning of the project. So that's why it's really important to try and correct mistakes at this stage, because if they are not corrected and they move down through the project, they can be very expensive and time consuming to change at a later stage. So it's very important, and that's why one of the reasons why the agile methodology, which baked in this idea of very tight cycles, iterative cycles, with close relationship between the end user and the project manager, has gained a lot of traction, as opposed to previous techniques like waterfall approaches which envisaged a one-way process where you literally tried to capture everything up front right at the beginning of the life cycle, assumed that that was correct, and then moved right to the end. So these days we advocate for the agile methodology, which is a lot more iterative and is much more likely to ensure that the user's requirements are baked into the methodology as you go forward. As I'm probably belaboring the point a bit, but it's something that is really very, very important. We see many cases where people do fantastic projects and build fantastically or develop fantastically, but they develop the wrong thing. And that's indicative of where failures are made right at the beginning in the requirements phase. It's really tragic to see a fantastic development effort, but that they don't quite get the requirements right. So it's worth emphasizing how important these early stages are. And of course, updating the documents and where necessary, getting signed approvals and making sure that everyone moves forward as one team. Right, so moving on to the next slide. One of the templates that's been included in the HIS Toolkit that's really useful is the design and development checklists. These are pretty long given all the considerations, but it is a very exciting phase in the project development process, and useful, as I've mentioned and tried to advocate, is to really try and go through this process very systematically to make sure as possible that one is capturing the requirements effectively and are really translating what the user needs into the documentation, which will be carried through into the development phases of the life cycle. And also bearing in mind something that we deal with often that I'm sure you encounter as well is that also users don't always, or users and project managers and people involved in the project often don't really know what they want. And sometimes we talk about gathering user requirements, whether that's functional or non-functional or even technical requirements. But there's a massive assumption there that people know what they want. And again, just emphasizing that that's not always a valid assumption. In fact, in my experience, it's usually not a good assumption, and that it becomes a voyage of discovery. So a lot of the methodology that's been built into the HIS Toolkit is really to guard against those common mistakes that people make. So going through the checklist there's a design component and a development component. I'm not going to necessarily go through all of those. It's a long list. It provides a checklist of some of the best practices in developing the design and development components. So including at design to clearly articulate the requirements gathering process that describes how to do interviews, workshops, from whom you should be gathering this information. So in other words, who should be actually eligible functional requirements, and how to elicit those requirements, how to draft them, and how to record them in specific templates, and then how to clearly document them, how to create use cases, to develop and validate a set of business processes or workflow models are some of the artifacts or methods that are used in order to extract and record these requirements, and to ensure that the team has considered a number of different features that need to be included, such as authentication and authorization. And then there are quite a number of others. And under development is to clearly document a process for moving design ideas into tickets for development. So that I think Trezor may explain a little bit later when he talks about the way that we manage the software development process as well, and the various ticketing systems that can be used to track the way that the software is developed and the features are rolled out. So again, just to say there's a useful set of checklists there that can be used to create the project plans for moving through the process. So talking about the main components of the HIS PM Toolkit design and development template. So this is the sort of table of contents for the design and development phase. And again, it's making the point that I've belabored earlier on about the central role that requirements play. This is, looking at this from an agile development methodology, but you can look at other methodologies as well. Another quite well used one is the architecture development methodology, which is being advocated by TOGAF, the Open Group Architectural Framework Project, which talks about how systems are developed at a national level or at an enterprise scale. And they also have a very similar approach where requirements are really placed at the center of the methodology. And it's very much like what's shown in this slide here, that as you move down through the different phases of requirements gathering, from business requirements to software requirements to technical requirements, functional and non-functional requirements, it's important to record those and to keep on checking back that the requirements are coherent and consistent. And as I said, make sure that anything that might look like it's disturbing what has been documented in terms of requirements should be interrogated and investigated and potentially documented, whatever the result is. So one of the most important activities is defining and documenting the requirements of the system and ensuring that these are clear, unambiguous, and agreed upon by all the relevant stakeholders. As mentioned earlier, these are going to be foundational to creating the software specifications down the line and need to be something which can be easily translated by software developers. Okay, so moving to the project requirements themselves, just to go back to the project phase, in the planning phase, you outline from whom and how you will gather the project requirements. And the general notion is that the project manager is the conductor of this process, and now is the time to start conducting and making the music, as the analogy goes. So, so this is generally the sort of process that one moves through, the project requirements. Generally working, as I mentioned, we're in this iterative process, building on from what was developed under the project charter and moving into the project requirements phase. So the planning template basically documents from whom and how to gather the project requirements. So that's the first component, the development of the planning template. And that's very, very important, as I mentioned earlier, that one uses key informants that really do understand the requirements. That may sound like an obvious statement, but often we find that the requirements are gathered from groups that don't necessarily include the key stakeholders. So these could be people who are eventually going to use the software on the ground, and others who might be involved in the management of the data. And so anyone who is really going to be integrally involved in the use of it is really one of the most important stakeholder groups to get those requirements from. So obviously what we are doing is trying to look ahead and to try and make sure that whatever is developed, assuming the development phase is successful, that it's going to be maximally useful and by the users on the ground. So it's really important to keep that in mind. It is something we also see from time to time. Software is developed goes through a whole process, even through a very good process of requirements gathering and documentation and interrogation, and yet still at the end, it's not something which is necessarily accepted by the end users. So that is what we're trying to guard against. And then during the design and development part of the planning phase, we prioritize the stakeholders and further refine how they will be engaged in order to gather the project requirements. So there's several different methods for gathering requirements with different types of stakeholders, key informant interviews, or could be focus group discussions, could be group meetings. You know, sometimes it's better to collect in a group meeting, because we find that one person's ideas around requirements help someone else think of a requirement that no one else thought of. And so collaboratively, you get to a better place in terms of documenting the full extent of requirements. At other times, it's also useful to have one-on-one meetings with people, key informants, to dive deeply into specific requirements as well. So there are different ways to do that. But this template that we have over here is a useful formalism for documenting that process. So including the stakeholder's name, organization, contact details, and then their impact and on the requirements. You know, in other words, how impactful their opinion or requirement that they may articulate will have on the project, their influence as well, and what is important to this stakeholder, how can this person assist, and how will the stakeholders be engaged. So those are some of the considerations in developing a sort of stakeholder matrix that can be used to create a plan for how to involve the different stakeholders in the requirements gathering process, and what techniques and ways to gather the requirements from them. So then the next one is the project requirements themselves. So it's at this stage, it is important to start to find what is in scope in as much detail as possible. So an example is that, for example, a system will export data for use in another system, like a CSV file export versus direct integration to a data analytics tool, with the caveat that at this stage, the requirements is still a long wish list. So again, there's, I find, you know, something of an art in gathering requirements. It's obviously one wants to try and be as comprehensive as possible and try to gather requirements that really encapsulate what will make the users of the system really happy and to use the system going forward, but also not to venture too far into creating a long wish list of requirements that may not be exactly what one wants to capture in this particular piece of software, or maybe it might be part of a different software, or it might just be wishful thinking. So that's why the recommendation here is to list topical areas that will be part of the project, and therefore in scope, but also be specific about what this functional requirement would actually do. And also to think through the different categories of requirements like security, availability, support, printing, etc., that might also be form part of the requirements. So the template that we have here to the right articulates the project requirements, and there we specify that the requirements capture and specify the specific intended behavior of the system being developed, and define things such as system calculations, data manipulation and processing, user interface and interaction, and other specific functionality that show how the user requirements are satisfied. Thinking really about how the users are going to use the system and all of the different actions that need to take place in order to satisfy that. And there we've got a section for defining the requirements that are in scope for the project, and also a section for, importantly, for documenting what is out of scope for the project. So that is really useful in the sense that it might be out of scope and therefore something that we eventually not going to do, but it's important that it's documented, because someone reviewing this, of course, could have a different perspective on this and might see something that's specified as out of scope, but which may actually, in fact, they may argue that it's actually in scope. So it gives one an opportunity to potentially review and revisit that. And again, there is something of an art in collecting the requirements at a sufficient level of granularity that can be turned into a use case and into a piece of functionality in software versus going into it, the requirement either in too much detail or capturing it in terms that are too vague and make it difficult to implement. So I think I've been through most of this already. The project requirements, as I mentioned, are the in-scope requirements with the categorization of that. And then almost as important as mentioned, there's capture what is out of scope. So just to say again, you know, those discussions that the team as a whole will have around functionality, and then eventually say that a piece of functionality is out of scope, is really not wasted time or effort, in the sense that it's quite possible that that may be useful in a different way. And it also helps set expectations for stakeholders, and also, you know, helps in the general dynamic in the requirements process by helping stakeholders feel that they've been heard and that their ideas have been taken seriously. And even if they are regarded as out of scope, that at least it has been documented and has been useful. And as we say there, this list may guide future iterations of the software as well. Okay, so moving on to the informational requirements. Just the idea here is that the ultimate goal of a health information system is to produce information that is accurate, reliable, timely, and actionable. And defining these requirements should be an afterthought or left to the end of the process. So it's very useful and good to capture these requirements as much as possible during the process. And a good sign that the product is being used are tickets about what improvements need to be made. So these requirements, the health information systems requirements, information component is key. And these requirements describe the reports and inquiries that the system must produce. So this is the viewpoint that documents what the outputs of the system are, in addition to the internal processing of it. So the information requirements section, just read the top of the template here that's been provided as part of the toolkit. The information requirements section defines the reports and inquiries that the system must produce. So these requirements will often be gathered from the stakeholders rather than users. It is also more demanding and difficult for the analyst to obtain these requirements accurately, because it invariably requires much more in-depth business knowledge. And reports may include operational reports, management reports, exception reports, control reports, system monitoring reports. So again, just one of the sets of documentation and requirements that are recommended to be captured during this phase are these informational requirements, as said there, so that they don't get lost in translation as one moves through the process. So this one pretty much says what I've just said there, except it makes the additional point that this can also be an iterative process, and it's useful to keep that template that we shared to organize the information and to complete this table for each requirement. So in other words, this template that we have here is can be used to store each individual requirement in a template like this. So to have to go through all of the different sections in that for each of the requirements. And as is said there, this step is often overlooked, but it is an important step and is recommended to be completed. So the next step that we'll talk through is the business processes or workflows. So this is a really important and very standard part of requirements definition, which is to go through with the users, the business processes or workflows of the system that is being served by the software that is being planned out, and then understanding that process really well and document it in this formal notation over here. So as mentioned there, this is a classic system to show the activities and tasks that will be part of the new system. And these diagrams help give developers an idea of the order of steps, users involved, and a description of activities performed. So just to say again, this is one of many of the different artifacts that are produced during this phase of the project planning and requirements definition, and provide a very useful viewpoint on the general flow that the process flow that the software will be sorting. This diagram over here is in a notation called BPMN, or Business Process Modeling Notation. This version, there are two ways that I find that there are two ways that this is generally used. This is a sort of older version, which generally only looks at the business processes. It doesn't try to document the actual information artifacts selected during that process. And there are a lot of reasons why advocates propose or advocate for focusing only on the process flow at this stage. There is another version of this that actually inserts in these diagrams the actual information process stores or sources and data sources and information repositories that either provide or are updated through the processes, which can also sometimes be useful to add to this process, particularly if it's a very information-rich system. Then sometimes it's useful to complement or to supplement these diagrams with additional BPMN notation, which indicates the data stores. So these lanes that we have here, which are called swim lanes, which I'll talk about on the next slide, you add additional swim lanes in there where you add in the information resources, which, as I said, can sometimes be useful. So, and then in terms of the BPMN or business process workflow, this defines the expected business processes or workflows in the new solution. The processes are normally described as a workflow. For example, the diagram shown below that shows how the information flows and is complemented by the description. So below the actual diagram there, we also show each one of those processes is further elaborated in the table below. So we give it a unique number and then a process name, then the role. So the user, you will also see in the left-hand side, you'll see two vertical columns and you'll see that one of the swim lanes, we call them, is labeled patient. So that is that articulates that particular swim lane, and then the description provides a narrative description of the process flow in there that is then shown with those process diagrams. So that's how this is constructed. I think it's beyond the scope of this to go heavily into the BPMN process, but certainly this deserves a course on its own in order to understand how to model accurately using BPMN or any other modeling notation. But it certainly is very valuable to know how to do this accurately. And again, as we were saying, this is one of the artifacts that is really useful to keep it updated during the requirements definition process, So start off drawing these diagrams and then update them as you go through the process and as new information becomes available. So this slide shows this in a little bit more detail here. And as I mentioned, the two swim lanes are shown there for the patient, and then the I can't really read the other one, but the different processes. So those are the processes that are basically aligned with that particular actor. So there's a patient actor in the system, and then all of the processes and how they interact. And as I mentioned, the table below, and very useful to keep that up to date as you move through the requirements development process. So this one provides further information on the development of the diagram, more or less saying what I've just said, that one goes through this process and keeps the table and the business process diagram up to date. So just a little bit more about BPMN notation, which is the notation that's used in this particular business process diagram. It is important to use the standard notation so that diagrams can be easily understood by others. So that's really the principle of having a standard notation, and remembering that these diagrams are primarily communication tools. So it's really important to try and stick to the notation and also to the way that the notation is recommended to be used. Then it's also useful, and I think this is a very important point, to try and understand what you're modeling when you draw these kind of diagrams. There's a big difference between, and it's useful sometimes to have two different viewpoints, one called the as-is business process, and then the to-be process, business process, and not to mix those up. So in other words, try to document, when you develop these processes, try to be very careful about documenting the as-is process and make it clear that this is documenting the system as it currently is now, and separating that from a separate diagram, which may show the to-be process. And that is really trying to document what the system should be like once it is implemented. So in other words, we sometimes find that people mix those up. So you have one diagram, which is a combination of kind of the system as it is now, but also a little bit of like the way they would like it to be in the future. And that can be super confusing. So useful, very useful to try and document these from those two perspectives, as it is now and how we'd like it to be in the future. And then, as I mentioned before, going into, synchronizing, keeping the documentation up to date and keeping the table aligned with what's being put in the diagram. And then there's a tip at the bottom here of the slide around two business process modeling tools, Draw.io and Bizagi. Those are both free tools, or Bizagi is semi-free. There is another one, I can't remember the name of it now, but there are one or two others that are out there that also provide free free diagramming, free tools for diagramming. Great. Let me just see where I am. So there, and then just on the next slide, I think, yeah, so that's, I think, about all that we want to say in terms of the business process or flow modeling. So that really concludes the section on the business process and requirements definition. I'm going to just talk a little bit now about the documenting the software requirements, and moving on to the first slide. So the software requirements is another really important perspective to document during this process, starting off with the stakeholder requirements. And again, using the work from the planning stage to conduct a stakeholder analysis, and which is looking at this. And if you look at this grid that we have documented there, there are two dimensions, the impact and the influence, and really looking at it from those two perspectives as we document the stakeholder requirements using the template to the right. So the high impact and versus high and low impact and versus high and low influence. So at this stage, it's important to identify the various stakeholders and look at the stakeholders identified in the planning stage to outline how this extends beyond the users and includes any systems, department, organization, or person that may have an interest in the software or solution, and ensure to document the decision makers in the system versus those stakeholders that must be kept informed. So you can think of things like a RACI matrix in order to document that information, and also document the expectations from the project for each stakeholder, and carry out the stakeholder analysis with the grid that we've documented below. The name of the stakeholder, the organization, contact details, etc. And then much like what we did earlier, the impact, influence, and then what is important to the stakeholder, how can this person assist, and how will the stakeholder be engaged? So just to say that there are many types and many layers of requirements, and this template provides a systematic and structured way of looking at them from the high level to the more detailed level. And different people may be responsible for producing different types of requirements, documents, from project managers documenting stakeholder requirements to business analysts documenting the software requirements, and on functional, informational compliance, etc. And then technical architects documenting the technical design or architecture. So the stakeholder requirements are a very useful way of ensuring that we understand and consider the needs and wants of everyone who will be impacted by the project, and not necessarily just involved. So again, here are the development of the project will be aligned with best practices for software development, and will be done in multiple iterations broken into sections called phases. While the specifics and design of each module will also be guided by the project sites and its requirements, the basic result of the first phase will be a minimum viable product, or MVP. So this is a product with enough features that it can be used to validate a product idea early in the product development cycle, and help the product team to receive user feedback as quickly as possible to iterate and improve the product. So again, it's this notion of iterating through the software development phase as you start to think about the software requirements, and start to transition from looking at the business or system requirements into what will now become baked into the actual software itself. So looking at these software requirements and using the notion of an MVP to also try and group those requirements into what is sufficient for the development of a first phase and a minimum viable product. That will be very useful, because sometimes the early phases of development will also be as much as a requirements validation tool as they are the actual end product. So it's very useful to understand how we iteratively develop the requirements, and that developing or specifying a minimum viable product actually feeds very well into the software specification process, because it gives one, again, an opportunity as early on in the process as possible, an opportunity to validate that is what is being captured in the design and development phase is actually going to eventually match what the user on the ground needs. So that's the process there. And in terms of the software requirements, there are a number of different phases or artifacts, as I mentioned. The software key principles that one would need to go through at this stage is to do a build or buy decision. It's again useful to look at, are we really, is build a good approach at this stage, or is this actually something that one can buy off the shelf and adapt. In-house or outsource? So is this something that the in-house team will be developing, or is it something that could be outsourced? And is it something that may be open source or proprietary? And if it's open source, is it something that could make use of an existing open source application which could be extended? Other considerations are the software functional requirements. So the key features, specifications, priority, estimation, level of effort, etc. And the performance requirements. So the specific software features and functionalities, and then design, development, and co-design planning. Also to consider how to engage the end users, who, why, when, and how. And then to document all of these, we've put together this software requirements template, which enables these to be documented and to considered and then documented as part of the process. Okay. So again, just saying what I said earlier, the software design and development should also be use user-centered design methods. So part of that agile methodology that I explained earlier is designed to really entrench that viewpoint. So in other words, we work the developers as they start with software requirements and specification is engage the users early on and as much as possible in an iterative process to try and make sure that we are guarding against diverging from what the users really want. So this is going back to the diagram we saw yesterday. When you go into those iterative phases of software development, and you may find that you're engaging with users with non-digital prototypes. You could use paper prototypes or just basic visualization methods to engage the users and help them understand the way the system is going to function. So there are a number of system analysis and design tools which enable you to kind of produce a mock-up of what the software would look like, which can also be really useful at this stage. So the project requirements tool. So this is another template that's provided as part of the toolkit. This is a simple tool that can be used to record the requirements. And how we recommend this is within the version set of documents, your high-level requirements will be agreed upon. When you transition to this document, which is more of a working document, you can transition from the high-level requirements into a more detailed requirement. And as you add requirements, you should think about how you will be testing this requirement and documenting this in the project requirements tool. So, and just to say, there are advantages of using a spreadsheet format in an actual spreadsheet so that you can do things like sorting or filtering by date, priority, etc. Great. And then again, another project requirement is the architecture overview. So this describes the proposed solution in a way that can be easily understood by stakeholders and shows the overall system. There are many ways and levels to describe the overall architecture. So we're talking about the software architecture here, from an abstract conceptual level to a more detailed application and technology level. However, one or two high-level diagrams should be sufficient to show the boundaries and components of the system and capture the core elements of solution. So one example of how to document an application architecture is also described in this document, but this may not be relevant for all solutions and is not the only way to describe it. So I've seen several approaches to the way that people describe or document or diagram out solution architectures or application architectures. Some of those are just, some people just use boxes and context diagrams, and others use much more detailed software or diagramming tools to achieve that. Moving on to the next slide, here are some of the examples of that. So this to the left, there's a context diagram. which just generally tries to document the boundaries of the software system. So what is the overall system? What are the main components in it? What are the interactions between those components? So again, this starts to make sense to software developers and software designers who start to understand what the overall architecture of the system would look like. Some other examples of architecture diagrams are shown to the right. The one in the middle is the Open HIE architecture, which is more of a conceptual architecture at a system level, which shows it's got icons for different classes of application software that might be created as part of an overall system, and then just how they are categorized more or less in a diagrammatic point of view. And then to the right is an enterprise architecture diagram, which would show an enterprise viewpoint on a system at an enterprise level, and all of the different components that you would find in that system, grouped by different, we sometimes call this an architecture on a page, because it shows at the top the sort of business architecture, followed by the information systems architecture and the technology architecture. So it tries to show you sort of how the business needs at the top are implemented in application software or in information systems below that. And then below the information systems, what are the applications that will be used to transform the information in the middle layer to satisfy the top layer? So I'm going to hand over to Trezor now. Hopefully, I've given you a useful introduction to the first part of the process, which is really the use from the user requirements through down to the software requirements process. And Trezor will now pick up from the hardware requirements point section. Thanks. Over to you, Trezor.
Yeah, before we move to Treasure, thank you so much, Dr. Chris, for the nice talk. There are actually a couple of questions in the question and answer chat box. I can read for you, maybe, if you'd like to respond. One of the questions was actually from Wendeson, Ethiopia. Is a design and development checklist need customized based on HIS project type? Can you use a generic one? This is one of the questions. May I go one by one, or I can read all the questions? Maybe Dr. Chris.
It's probably best if I just answer as we go along. I'm not sure how much time we have. So yeah, we probably went a bit longer than I really thought, but I'll just answer them as best I can. Just to say, I think that's a really good point. I think the template is meant to be fairly generic in the sense that it should apply to most projects. But I think it's probably likely that some degree of customization would be useful. I think what would be actually also useful would be to try and to have a system where those customizations could actually be fed back to the group that's maintaining this toolkit and possibly used to include in future versions.
All right.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you so much. The other question from Branu, actually, it's a confirmation. Why don't we develop a standardized requirement gathering template for HIS for data consistency, compatibility, and interoperability? I think this is a confirmation, not a question.
Yes, no, we do have a standard. I think part of the toolkit, there is a standard requirement template, which documents the various sections in that should be completed, both for functional requirements, for non-functional requirements, technical requirements, and even architectural requirements. So I believe those templates do exist.
Yeah, great. The other question from Maria, what is co-design? How it differs from other software development approaches?
Sorry, did you say co-design?
Co-design, yeah, exactly.
I'm not familiar with that actually or maybe I can just understand, is that co-design, meaning co-designing with another group or with someone else?
It was actually from Arya Mesfin, how it differ from other software development approaches. I think he's assuming co-design is part of software development approach. So how it is different from other software development. I think better we skip this one.
Yeah.
Maybe he can
Maybe-
reflect. Yeah.
Maybe Trezor can take a shot at that one. He may be more familiar with that than me.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Chris. And then again, here I'm assuming if I'm not getting it correct, please feel free to drop the message in the message box. I don't know if that by co-design you're talking about like user-centered design, where you really working, end to end with end users to get feedback from them and then design along with them, right? If that is the case, obviously it is a very a very good approach to do design. To get involved the end users or all users of the system as early as possible. And then the idea there is really to start, breaking up or sharing ideas in a way that makes sense to them. Usually, it involves putting together those very high-level wireframe of the solution that need to be built to get early on feedback from the users and then move along with user and then sort of co-designing with them. So if that is the case, I'll say then, yeah, so the main thing is with that co-design approach is that you get your users, could be end users or or other key stakeholders involved in the process early on, and then not build and then get them to do user acceptance tests at the later stage. So the idea is to get them involved very early on the project. That's the main difference. And obviously the main benefit is to get early feedback that drive kind of the design and development process of the project.
Yeah, great, Treasure. Thank you so much. The last question was, is it possible to design stakeholder requirements symmetrically? Yeah.
So did you say to develop stakeholder requirements? Did you say symmetrically?
Yes. Symmetrical, yeah.
Again, I'm not really sure I understand what that means, to be honest.
Yeah, it's
Trezor, any ideas from your side? Symmetric?
Not quite, to be honest. Maybe that thing can be clarified into the chat, and then can try to address it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Better we
Sorry
proceed.
for that.
Yeah, no problem. It's okay. Better we proceed to the session by Treasure. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Trezor, I'll stop sharing. Are you going to share from your side?
Yes, please. I will.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chris, and then good afternoon or morning, everyone.
Thanks very much.
And then it's really a pleasure to get to facilitate this second part of the training. I'll be sharing my screen just now, really quick. All right, so I should be able to see my screen. Just confirming with everyone if you're able to see my screen.
Yeah, we're looking at your screen. Yeah, thank you.
All right, cool. Thanks. All right, so we'll continue with our hardware requirement. But before we jump into that, just a really quick overview. I'll be covering hardware requirement, and then we'll also be discussing training and capacity building, policy compliance, security planning, and then finally we'll end with closing or wrapping up the design and develop phase. What are the steps to that? And then after that, we'll dive into some practical approach to software development life cycles, and then how in practice this is done, and then how can approach that. And then we'll also have a really quick review or demo of a project management tool, and we'll look at ClickUp. So we'll see how times allows us to do that. All right, so we'll start with hardware requirement. So, after all the steps that Chris mentioned, like where, you get to a point where you have your software development requirement, among other requirements, your architecture, your enterprise architecture as well. So the next step is to really start planning your infrastructure, right? So these are like the hardware that need to support your project. And again, here, as for the rest of, the previous requirement phases, you need to be very specific on what is the hardware need for your project. So that will include things like the hardware type that you need, like computers, I don't know, servers, mobile devices could be phone or tablets, or even network equipment, printers, or anything else like in between. And then in terms of the details you want to get into, that could include like the brand name you want to use, the specification of your hardware, like how much RAM you want for your computer, CPU, how much memory, the type of memory you want, etc. Obviously, all those decisions are guided by your software requirement and everything else. So it's all really depend on what you're going to need. And then obviously the size and securities are part of it. Security falls into like sort of like compliance. You want to make sure your system comply to, and then we'll go into that in more detail just now. And then after you have a fairly good idea and documented the equipment that you need, it's also important to dive into how that hardware will be deployed and maintained, right? So that include details such as who will be responsible to do the work, what kind of maintainability is going to be required. So because it's very easy to forget about those very important details, because it's not really about deploying the system, but it's also important to think of sustainability. How are you going to keep the system up and running after it is deployed? And then how are you going to approach all those processes? And then the last step is also like to think of like the availability requirement. And then here it's really important to have a clear idea of like how often the system is going to be used, what are the operating hours, what are the expected downtime, and then the impact, etc. And then this becomes important, like when you, for instance, choosing to use your system in the cloud, where you are billed by every hours or sometimes even by the minutes, right? So if you know that there are downtime or there's space where you do not need the system, you can plan ahead for that, because there are cloud provider nowadays that actually makes it possible to define specific time where your server goes down, and then that really can significantly reduce the cost for your infrastructure, which is important for long-term sustainability planning. So it's also important to keep that in mind when and how your system is going to be used, and then plan it into your hardware requirement. So the next slide really just speaks of an example of like what the specification may look like. So you can again detail the type of equipment you need, like computers, printers, barcode scanning, or or A4 printers, etc. You can go into the details of like the type of CPU you want, how much RAM you need, the type of hard drive and space that you need. That this also can include even like your flow planning. This is quite useful to do as well. That helps you to really have a look of like what is the how you wanna install your computer network and in the various rooms available that need to be covered. I can give you insight on the type of equipment you need. If like for instance you have two buildings that are further away apart, maybe it makes sense to have a wireless type of connection between the two buildings, or if they're close enough, maybe like a wire will work, and etc. So having it in place, like the building plan can also help with giving you insight on the type of network or equipment that you need to set in place. But overall, like in a nutshell, the key takeaway here is really to start to be as systematic as you can, and then capture as much detail as possible to really reduce the number of surprises when it comes to executing your hardware requirement later in the process. And right here also, so this slide is really about, kind of some, gotcha to be aware of. And then specifically, I'd like to speak of, the importance of being aware of the environment that you're operating in, because that can affect the type of requirement that you need. So if you are in a place like where, for instance, electricity isn't that reliable, then using, for instance, a UPS in an instance, I mean, in a place where the power goes off all the time can significantly reduce the lifespan of your UPS. So that is just an example, right? Because those units are designed, to provide, a short power backup, but it's not really designed to be like, going on and off all the time, for instance. And that might really, again, affect your long-term sustainability if like a UPS need to be replaced after a year or more regularly because of like, well, the power going on, off on a regular basis. So obviously you need to be aware of that. So maybe instead of UPS, you need also like a backup power facility, like maybe solar or I don't know, a generator, etc., to really help to maintain the health of your UPS. That is just an example of this, the type of thinking that you need to go through while planning for your hardware. But it can be many things. It can be like the level of humidity you're dealing with in a specific area where you are that can affect the longevity of your hardware, or anything else really in between, right? So if you are you're living next to the sea where there is a like wind and high level concentration of salt, and maybe you will need equipment that are that are well protected against the salt that can affect metals. And yeah, it can really be a million things to think about. But these are just points to really help that to take into account the environment while planning for your hardware requirements. And then the next thing is that, as you start procuring, implementing your hardware, it's really important to keep an inventory going, to keep track of everything that you're getting. So this is just a template that can help really, documenting the hardware with the name, type, the models, etc., and then other types of information as well. So that like from the get-going, what are the equipment that you have. And obviously, this is just a generic example. It can be extended to include even more information. But here they are like obviously the key one that you would want to have in place, like the maintenance period, like expiration date, so that you, again, when you're planning your long-term sustainability, the type of running cost that you'll have to keep on renewing your equipment to keep the system up and running. So the next one is training and capacity building. And then again, this one sounds a very obvious one, but very often when planning projects, it's very easy to focus only on the user capacity building. But here, really the key takeaway from this slide is that it's important to look at it from, in a much broader way, that it's not only end users, but there are also other actors. Do not forget, like people that be maintaining the system, implementers, could also even be developers. If it is a system that need to evolve over time, maybe you will need to start adding more report as you're moving along, because the reality is that we function in environments that are highly dynamic with new things coming along. So if that is going to be the case, obviously you need to think of training developers as well, training your system admin, maybe project designer, and etc. So it's not only end users, but it's really important to think of this broadly, and then to know upfront the type of training and capacity building that you need to put in place for the project. And then the next one important one is also policy compliance, especially in the domain of health. So it's very important to be aware of all the policies, like both international or maybe local one, to be aware of. So that could include like international standards, or data privacy and security policy that can be implemented at the level of a country or regions or a specific domain, right? your IT policy, and everything else. So it's really important to do that exhaustive analysis of all the policies that you need to comply on. And then for each one of them, it's important to document how, what is the plan to comply to those specific policy, right? So that could include details such as what is the verification process? How do you check and then know that you are compliant? Who is going to be the champion that is responsible to ensuring compliance and among other things? And so it's important to do that through all the policies that you have and then document them as you're moving along on the project to make just sure that you are compliant and then you know that the project is going to be legal and it doesn't break any important compliance consideration. And the next one is security planning as well. This somewhat falls into, usually falls into, your policy compliance. Security usually is one of them. But again, as we're talking about health data here, it's highly, highly important and sensitive matter, obviously. Like it's really important to make sure that you're complying in terms of your security of data, privacy of the data that you are, the system could be using. So that could include both, at the software level, what are the security compliance you need to, adhere to in terms of, software, but that also could include also hardware security. So again, the hardware part is something that is often very easy to overlook. It's important to keep an eye on. So that could include things such as, this physical security of the server, like the server room where you're keeping your equipment. Is it secure? Is it well protected against like someone breaking in and stealing the server, right? And then even that happens, like you need to have plan in place on if that happens, are the data safe, right? Do we have like proper software that are encrypting the data on the server so that even if it is stolen, we don't get into a massive leak of sensitive personal information, right? And that also can include like your backup plan. Like do you have your equipment backed up on different physical locations so that if there is a problem on one server, you still have other servers that can help your system to continue up and running. So all those considerations are important to analyze upfront to help guide really like mitigation plan in advance on how you'll make sure that your system is safe and secure. And then for the closing part, to wrap up this exercise of design and develop, we did go through like a number of tools and templates and activities that need to be done. So on the left-hand side, I know it's auto readable, but I believe this slide will be shared. So there's a really quick summary of your checkboxes, right? In terms of design and development, what are the steps that need to be done? So it's really important to systematically go through those checkboxes and ensure that you have all the steps completed. But then more importantly, it is very, very important to have the correct people sign off like all the previous steps, just to make sure that all the key stakeholders are aligned and then everyone is in sync and understand or even agree on like the requirement gathered so far, and then we all align on like what the project is going to be doing. So again, very easy to overlook on this very important step. So it's very important to make sure that there is a proper sign off. So that's really mostly it. So before we jump into question and answer, I'd like to go and cover the second part I wanted for today, that is software development lifecycle and then tooling. And then for this, I just wanna try to move this little bar across here. So okay, all right, that's better. So for the tooling part, I say that I'll be discussing or going through ClickUp. That is a project management tool that can be used for managing your software development lifecycle. But before going into the ClickUp itself, I'd like again quickly going through like the agile process, it can be done in practice. And then I'll be talking quite a lot on the way we do it in JMB, but it's fairly generic that can obviously be adapted. And then after that, we'll dive into the actual tooling and then how you can automate managing your software development lifecycle using ClickUp. So as Chris mentioned, there are several approaches when it comes to software development project management, and then the one that is very used nowadays is the agile process. And then that, as Chris mentioned, it comes from the fact that we recognize that everything is very dynamic. We live in the world where things are changing quite quickly, and then because of that, it's very hard to know upfront a very detailed requirement of what will need to be done. So instead of like planning absolutely all the details upfront and then start building for a very long time and then only to discover later in the process that the product built doesn't really match the reality, which will be a very costly thing to do. We more and more going into an iterative way of doing things where you work on shorter iteration where you get all the stakeholder involved. You sort of like build bit by bit with insights and feedback from everyone. So this really helps a lot to adapt very quickly to changes. So the idea here is really not to see changes as the enemy, but as an important part of the process, to really be able to be flexible and then adapt to the ever-changing, world that we live in. So that's really, like in a natural world, the agile process is all about. And then even the agile itself, there are many ways to do it. And like there are two approaches used in the agile world. So one is called Scrum that we use a lot in JMB as well. And then the other one is called Kanban. They are both very similar with very few subtle differences between them, but they overall very similar. They're all based on the idea where you're working in cycles with many iterations, getting feedback from all the stakeholders on like a regular basis. The Scrum process is a lot more formal with much more ceremonies compared to Kanban. While Kanban is more of like gives a lot more flexibility where you basically moving with the flow, ensuring that the team has a limited amount of tasks or tickets that they're working on, and then closing them before picking on the next ticket. While on the Scrum world, you're trying to sort of like break your work into what they call sprints, right? Which is like a cycle of work that usually is 2 weeks. That is actually what we use in JMB as well. But it can be cycle for 1 week or even more than 2 weeks, depending on really what you are doing. But 2 weeks is fairly typical. And then the plan with Scrum is that the team, agrees with what is the next iteration of the product is going to be. So that iteration is defined in terms of what they call user stories. That's just a description of work or task that is going to help to increment the product to the next version or the next iteration of your product. So the team usually will agree on a number of user stories or ticket to complete during the course of the 2 weeks cycle. So that is usually done through a sprint, a ceremony that is called sprint planning. So it's really like the team coming together. By the team, I mean both developers, a product owner that will represent usually your client, and then project manager and then other stakeholders as well. They come together and decide on what is that we want to commit for the next cycle, right? So once that decided, the team will go into the sprint cycle. That is the 2 weeks where they will essentially work on the ticket for 2 weeks period. And then at the end of the cycle, there is what is called a sprint review. That is another ceremony where the team now present back to the stakeholders the new iteration of the product. So this is now helps to give a chance to everyone else to start really reviewing where we are with the product and then decide on what is going to be the next step, right? And then the plan is always to move to like your next version of a functional product that gives everyone insight on the value that the new product is now giving, and then deciding on what it makes sense to change the course of action to decide on what is going to be the next feature that we want to focus on, or maybe if there have been changes in the environment that we need to change, the requirement, that also the time for that. So basically, after the review session, you have your next, again, sprint planning for the next cycle, and then again, the cycle repeats itself. So that's really high level that cycles, sprint cycles works. And then usually also at the end of the cycle, there is what is called a retrospective ceremony. That is just the team meeting and then discussing on what went well or what didn't go so well in order to learn and then improve obviously the process, right? So the idea is like to get to that learning, to do that learning activities and to learn from experience, to document all the wisdom obviously that the team is gaining through that entire process. So that's really high level how it works. So the key elements here are your user stories that represent this great piece of work that the team is committing to do during a cycle or a sprint period. That is a cycle of usually 2 weeks. So that's it. And then the other important thing to mention here is that during the phase of planning, the team also estimates the level of effort or level of complexity, the relative level of complexity of all the user stories. And then the way this is done is that each user story is assigned what we call a story point, right? So these are like numbers that usually follows the Fibonacci series. It will usually be 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and then etc. Right? So you give a point that, as I said, represents the relative level of complexity or level of effort it will take to complete the specific work. And then in the agile world, like we try as much as possible to stay away from estimating the actual time it will take to do the work, because time estimation is complex, it's hard to know upfront, and then it also depends on obviously the person that is doing the actual work. So the idea is really to try to keep it generic and then to rather estimate the complexity of the work that without really linking it to time directly, even though there are some subtle relationship between time and then complexity. So right, so those story points really become a sort of like measure that helps to know what the team can commit to, so that the total points that the team can commit to is called velocity, right? So if we say that our team has a velocity of 25 points, that just simply means that in the course of a sprint, the team can take 25 point worth of work. And then that velocity is also very dynamic because it's really depend on factors such as the number of developers that are available for the given sprint, and then their availability as well. So if a developer is 100%, or maybe there'll be 50% if they are shared between one or several projects. So all those inputs are used to calculate the velocity for the coming sprint, and then to help decide on how much work can go into the sprint. And obviously, once that's done, we know what we're going to be doing in the sprint. The team can sort of like focus for the period of 1 to 2 weeks to do the work, and then review toward the end. So that's really high level how like that iterative agile way of working is implemented in practice. And then now, to help manage its whole operation and process, we obviously use tooling, project management tooling. And then ClickUp that I'll be presenting now is one of them. And again, it's worth mentioning, it is not the only tool. Obviously, there are others. Jira is another very popular one that's used for that purpose. But there are many others really that helps to do that, right? And then, but here for the purpose of this presentation, we'll be reviewing ClickUp as a tool for your project management. So as I was saying so the idea is that you need to have your list of stories or tickets to load them into your tool. And then in ClickUp, there is this notion of list, right? So a list is really like, can think of it as a sort of like your project, but you can model it to be many things you want, but it can also be a project. So as an example, for instance, this is like a ClickUp, that we're using in Jambi. So if I go under project development, I have a number of lists that represent the various projects that we are working on at the moment, GenPI, OpenIM, platform, etc. So all these are products that Jambi is currently working on. So if I click on one product, for instance, I'll click on OpenIM. Now, can I start looking at the user stories that I was mentioning before, that these are those small boxes that represent discrete pieces of work that the team are working on. And then the way those user stories are organized is that they are grouped into various queues that you're looking at now. So there's an inbox queue, backlog, current priority, in progress, review, and done. And then at this point here, I would like to say that it's up to the team to decide what are the queues that they want to have in the workflow. The queues are really the steps that your project or that your user stories need to go through, like in your workflow. And then those might differ from project to project or team to team. So each team can decide on what are the queues that make sense for the specific project. And then for the case of Jambi, we did a work to harmonize the queues across all the projects that we're using in the company. And then these are, we have an inbox, a backlog, current priority, in progress, review, and finally done. And I'll just quickly describe what those are. But again, this is just an example. You can customize them to be different depending on the type of project that you're doing. So the inbox one is really where all the tickets start, right? So that's where we dump all the ideas or all the requirements. So that will include both the things that we know that we need to do and even the nice to have one, right? So the one that we're not entirely sure if we want to do or not. So that is like the starting point where we sort of brainstorm and then document all the requirements. Usually they'll be fairly high level, or it can also be detailed if we have all the information already. And then from the inbox here, the next one, the next step is what we call a backlog. And then for our case, we call backlog the work that we are committing to. So from the inbox, after reviewing and analyzing and prioritizing the inbox items, if there are items we know now we have to do them at some point in time, we move them into the backlog. This is just a parking lot for all the work that we know we're committing to do at some point in time. And then usually here at this point already, we'll also have a due date, right? That is essentially by when we want to do the specific piece of work. We haven't started working on it yet, but we know that we will be doing it at some point in time. And then also when the work moves into the backlog, we'll also do some work to start adding more details on what the description on what need to happen on those specific pieces of work. And then from the backlog here, the next step is what we call a current priority. And then again, in the context of Jambi, a current priorities include the list of the work that is now part of the current sprint, right? So, or the current 2 weeks cycles. So if in this, we know that we have committed to do this work and then now we want to do it into, part of the current cycle, we'll move it from the backlog into the current priority. So that will be an indication to the team that this is effectively what we are working on at the moment, right? So even if the dev work, the specific dev work hasn't started yet, we know that in these 2 weeks, this is what we are working on. So those the next queue here, like the current priority, in progress, and review, are effectively the work that the team is currently doing in the current cycles. Start with the current priority that will be pretty much like the to-do list for the team for the current cycle. And then when the developers start doing the work, obviously to move it to in progress, that means that someone is actively working on the specific item, and then that way at that point you'll actually have a name attached to it with like the person who is currently assigned to, who's doing work on that specific piece of work. And then once they are done, the next step in our process is the review process. That is someone else reviewing the work that they did. So once the dev work is completed, the specific work item move into the in review. And then again, one person will pick the work item and then review it. If they're happy, everything goes fine, the review is completed, it will move to the done list. That is a parking lot to say like the work has been completed, right? But if they have feedback or comment, maybe like a few changes need to be done, then it will return to in progress to someone to work on the feedback or comment, or could potentially also return back to the current priority if no one is working on it as of yet. So that's really in a nutshell the process that we're using in JMB. But again, this can change depending on the type of workflow that you have for your project and life cycle. But this is what we are working on, and then what we use ClickUp for. And again, ClickUp being a project management tool, obviously it is very configurable. It makes it possible for you to decide on those queues for your workflow, right? And then I'll quickly show how you can do that. But like the key point to note here is that in your project management tool, you can decide on your workflow, and then what are the steps, what are the starting step of your work, what are the in progress, and then what are the closing step of your workflow. So there's a way to define all that. And then the second thing I would like to talk about is also when I click on a ticket, obviously there is a description where you can add more information, but there is also this notion of fields, right? Where you can add specific field that helps you to add specific pieces of information to your ticket. So when you set up your tool, it's possible to add custom fields that are specific to your workflow, to your management style, right? Like for instance, when we loaded the tool, we add by default the status, the date, and an assignee. But we had to add, for instance, the sprint point because we want to be using this to calculate the level of complexity. We added a field to track time, to estimate the time, etc. So it is possible to add your own custom fields to your ticket, and I'll also quickly show you how this can be done in ClickUp. And then the last point I want to mention is that you can include automations into your workflow. Okay, so you can create rules such as like if someone maybe move a ticket from the backlog to a current priority, this needs to happen, or maybe the system needs to set up automatically that the start date for your work to signify that the work has started. That is just an example of automation that can put in place, but it can be really literally anything, right? So you can have events, right? And then attach events to automatic action that need to happen on your ticket, to align with your specific workflow. And then again, I'll also demonstrate how you can do that in ClickUp. And again, just to show you how this configuration is done. So at the level of, my our product development space, by clicking this little 3 dot here, we have a space setting menu where you can see automations. I just mentioned automation now, but I will go through it just now. But I want to start it, first of all, with your task statuses that helps you to define the queues that I mentioned now. So if I click on it, you can see all the queues that we have: the inbox, backlog, current priority, in progress, review, and then finally done. And then those queues are grouped into categories: not started, active, done, and closed, right? So there are some little plus dot here that allows you to add even more, to add more queues or statuses to your different stages of your workflow. So this is essentially how you can go and then define your workflow steps and apply them across your project. And then ClickUp also allows you to create templates. So for instance, these specific settings is linked to what we call a default JMB workflow. And then now that we have a template, we can just apply that template to many other projects. So that is how we achieve, applying the same workflow for the entire JMB, right? So I just say that these are the steps we're using for all our projects. And then we achieve that by creating a template in ClickUp that can be applied to many, categories of projects within JMB. So that's how we did that. So I'm gonna close that really quick. So that's how we did set up the queues. And then I also mentioned that you can customize the field, and then this is how you do that. So under settings, you go to custom fields. And again, here you can see like a number of fields that we added, like the OG due dates, timestamp, donor code, project. So those are things that are specific to the work we do. What are the team working on that? Who is the activity lead, etc. So you can create a new field here. So there's a space to do that, where you can create your own custom field. And then you can also decide where that field lives under this location thing. So for instance, there are fields like the donor code that is specific only for a program. That is our program division. That fields make sense only for our program division, because they need to link the specific work activity to donor code. But again, this is very specific to the way JMB works. But the key takeaway here is that you can customize the field that you're using in your tool to make it really align with your specific workflow, right? So I'll close here. So that's essentially how you can customize your field. And then the last one was the automation part. And then this is how you can do that. So again, under space settings, you go to automations, and then that's where you can create your automation. So we have 3 of them. Like, one status change the start date. That is just an example of automation, right? So whenever you change the status of your ticket, we want to include a start date. And then like we have 2 other automations, and we can create more. So if you go to add automation, I'll just show you how it works. There are 2 parts. So there's a trigger here that specify which event that need to trigger the automation, right? And then there's a number of them that are already available. And then those trigger can be either on your task, subtask, or task or subtask at the same time. You define where, what is the ticket level where that should trigger the specific event. And then you can now specify the actual event itself, like a task that gets created, a custom field that changes, or a status that changed, etc. So all those are all possible triggers. And then on the right-hand side, you can now define the action, right? What should happen when that triggers happen? And again, there are a number of predefined, actions, like set a custom field, change an assignee, etc. Right? So you can, use any of those actions, right? Or you can even use integration to add extra actions that are not part of the list, like doing something in GitHub, etc. Right? So all those, it's a very flexible and powerful tool that can really allows you to accomplish a lot. So you can do things such as, when a ticket is created, I want, for instance, to go in and create a branch in my code repository. So you can totally do that through automations, right? So that's essentially how this is done. But again, we won't be able to go into all the details. This is just to give everyone an overview of how you can manage your project. So once you have your queues, your custom field, you have your automation, basically you have your system in place to start helping you managing your cycles, your bi-weekly or weekly agile cycles, and then to help manage your day-to-day operations. And then the last bit I'd like to cover before closing it here, maybe giving everyone a chance to ask questions, is that ClickUp also allows you to have some form of reporting. So for instance, right here, so when you click on this opening space on top here, we're looking at the board view, but you can have some more reports. So we, for instance, have a dashboard that gives us some key indicators, right? So like the number of tasks that are unassigned, the tasks that are in progress, how many tasks have been completed so far, some key updates on the project, and then some, number of tasks per person in the project, so to see that who has a lot on their plate at the moment. and a percentage, etc. So it can really be, this is something that is highly customizable, so you can really add more as much details as you wish, really, to start getting insight on your workflow, right? Obviously, going into the details on how to customize this will be out of the scope of this work, but just want to highlight that this is something possible to do. You can create your dashboard and several types of reports. Like we have our project as a list view with the list of all the activities going on now. We have a Gantt chart here that shows us the in a Gantt chart the work. Oh, sorry, so now click again. Yeah. The pieces of work, this is today, and then what's coming up in process, like in the future, the dependencies between the tasks, right? And then where we're going, etc. So that's a possibility. We have a view for the team, and the list goes on, You can see like all the team members, and then what are they up to, the number of tickets they did, what are still not done, etc. And then the list goes on. And then obviously you can also add your own report or view to help you start tracking activities happening on your on your teams, on your agile process. So with that said, I think I'll wrap it here to give everyone a chance to ask questions. Hopefully this has been helpful to give everyone a sense of like how managing an agile process can look in practice, like in practical term, and then the tooling that can be used to help with that. So I'll maybe end it here and then pause, and then possibly open the floor for questions or comment or remark. So thanks everybody for the contribution.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much, Teresa, for the nice presentation, including you were sharing your experience. Let me allow participants to speak questions. Maybe Nuguse, you can proceed to your question. Nuguse, please. Okay, maybe Dajani. Dajani, you can unmute yourself, by the way. Dajani, you can unmute for asking your question. Okay, in the meantime, I think there are questions in the chat box. You can maybe, Treasure, you can go through them one by one, starting from the last. Are you able to go in the chat box, question and answer box? One of the question is, how we gonna fix if the automation is not compatible with software? This is one question from Masala.
Okay, cool. Thanks. That is a great question. So first of all, the first insight is what I mentioned, the retrospective meeting at the end of each cycle, right? So the idea is that at the end of each cycle, the team need to meet and discuss on what did go well and what didn't go well. And then among the things that didn't go well includes also like the process and the steps and everything that is being done to help manage your cycle. So if you find specific items that are not working for you, that the space to discuss it with the team and then decide on what changes need to be done. It could be literally anything, right? So if the queues maybe you're using the statuses you're using for your whole workflow isn't ideal, you can decide as a team to make amendment and then to change it. And then once that's decided, you can really very easily go in your tool now to start changing it, as I was demonstrating it earlier. So you can go and then add maybe more steps or remove steps that are really not making sense, or you can even add automation to help you keep track of important things, to remind you and important actions that need to be done on various steps of your process, right? And then again, the whole process management is very iterative as well. So you will make the changes and then sort of like test it in the next cycle, and to get feedback on if this is working or not, and then again further refine and modify it as you're moving along. So that's really in a nutshell how you manage changes and improvement for your processes in agile methodology.
Yeah, great, thank you. The other question from Melissa: is there any clear roadmap and user-friendly guidance that depicts the design and development process, schedule, required resource, and milestone in managing software development projects?
All right, cool. So I believe in the toolkit there are some templates that can help with that roadmap. Obviously the key point here is you want to be as systematic as possible, because as Chris and myself presented it while presenting, it's very easy to overlook important step while going through the process. That's why like a roadmap or some form of templating in place are very important. Just make sure that you're thinking about all the important steps, so you're not missing important steps. And then these, I believe, are included into the toolkit. So we quickly went through some high-level pointers of things that you need to keep an eye on. But it's important to be very systematic with this process, and having templates in place helps a lot. With that.
All right, thank you. The other question from in the chat box was, what are the main discussion points with the stakeholders in terms of requirements?
Okay, cool. So I'll take a stab of that, and then Chris, also please feel free to jump in here and then complete what I'll say. Yeah, so I mean, for the stakeholders, obviously it's important to understand what are the needs. I mean, what are the expectations on the system? What are the value they're seeing on the system? So it's very important to include that into the discussions. And then another important discussion point is also obviously prioritization, because what you will discover often is that when you start those conversations, you get a very, very long list of things that can potentially be done. It's very important area in the process to also prioritize and then decide on what is more important than what is higher priority, basically. And then that also speaks to what Chris was mentioning earlier around the minimum viable product, or MVP. So we really need to decide on what will be the first version of, or the first phase of your project, because obviously you don't want to try to do everything in parallel, because you have very limited time and resources. So it makes sense to restart with a smaller version of the product that can help really validate the value and use case, and before moving to the next phase. So that's really a few topic that I can mention that could be useful for discussion with various stakeholders. I don't know, Chris, you have more to add to this?
Thanks, Trezor. Could I ask, was the question mostly just about stakeholders in general, or was it during specifically in the sprint support review process?
Yeah, I think it's more like on the planning phase, or what are the key items to discuss with stakeholders during the planning phase?
I mean, I think, in terms of the Agile Manifesto, the role of the stakeholders, well, the whole objective, as you also mentioned, of Agile is really around ensuring close proximity between the developers and the different role players in the project, i.e. the business analysts, systems analysts, and developers and architects, proximity to the relevant stakeholders that they are engaging with. So I think it's, the answer there is to that, trying to identify the correct stakeholders at each one of those points in the process is really, really important in order to get the right information from them, so that you can, translate those requirements as specifically as possible into the documentation that's needed for that phase of the cycle. So in other words, the stakeholders that you may speak about at the initial phases of the project could be quite different from some of the stakeholders that you are talking to during the software requirement development process, and really trying to move systematically through this process from business requirements down to software requirements, and engaging the correct stakeholders, and then passing that documentation on through a requirement repository. And one of the things we didn't really speak about in too much detail was having this requirements repository, I think, is key to the whole process to help with the translation of this, so that you end up with the right people giving requirements to the right problem as you go through the process. I hope that answers it, but that's that's what I have to say.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Chris. Maybe Umar, you can unmute yourself and you can ask your question. Umar, yeah. Go ahead, please. You can speak. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you very much for both presenter and coordinators. And today's presentation was very fantastic. And thank you. So my question goes to both for the presenter and the coordinators. Since we are now a trainer for this data management process, I want to ask the coordinators, since we are a trainer, do you have a chance to use those kinds of tools and these kinds of platform in order to practice what we are learning in these presentations? So it's very crucial for our future work in research coordinations in data management system. So I need to have this answer. So it needs a practice, because it is a scientific manner in this platform. So my comments to the presenter is, so do we have access for this kind of GMB platform? So do you have any recommendations? And it is a pay method or a subscription method? Thank you very much, if I understand my question.
Yeah, thank you. Normally, before, yeah, we will be sharing you the recording, starting from Monday session until now. We are sharing you the recording. I think you can access that one. That is actually a resource material. At the end of all the sessions, if we get a slide from the presenters, we will still sharing you that resource material as well. Yeah, that is actually the resource we have from our side. Maybe, do you have anything to say, maybe Treasure or Chris, regarding the Jumpy's facility, the possibility of, yeah.
Yes, I could take the first stab at this, and then Tresor can also correct me. So as the person rightly pointed out, ClickUp is a subscription tool. So we buy a subscription to it. And the other one we worked with before, Jira, which was also a paid for tool. I think in some cases you can get very substantial discounts or even free access for certain organizations. But an alternative to that is on the open source side, there is a ticketing system called Redmine that we also use with CDC to map and manage projects, which can also be used for this kind of activity. It obviously doesn't have the level of functionality that you would get from ClickUp or Jira, but it is an open source and one that can be freely used. So we installed a server at JMB at one stage and used it. It's not as functional, but I mean, that is generally the case with open source software. There may be others that Tresor may know about. Tresor, any ideas from your side?
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. Not really. I think that's probably like the main one. Maybe if I can mention another one that works in the cloud. That is GitHub. Because everyone is aware of GitHub as a code repository source management tool, but it also comes with some basic project management functionality as well. It can allow you to create tickets and collaborate in the tool, assign them. Can allow you to create workflow and like a few basic things that I mentioned when going through ClickUp. But obviously, again, it doesn't have the level of functionality that you will have with ClickUp with advanced dashboarding or reporting, etc. But it's still good enough to be a starting point. So GitHub is a possibility. It has the advantage of being in the cloud, so you don't need to install it locally. You can just use it for free on your project. So that's also a possibility.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Helpful information.
Zelalem, I also want to jump in here. I'm sharing the recording from yesterday and from before yesterday. I already did share on the chat box. People keep emailing me. One thing I need to tell you is all the messages that you are receiving regarding the sessions are automated messages that we cannot control. The reminders are not something that we are controlling. It's automated message. And regarding the material, when we receive the material from the instructor, we will share so kindly. I will really appreciate if you can stop emailing 100 times. I mean, thank you.
Yeah, great. Maybe do you have any question, Nugus Werku? You are raising your hand. You can unmute yourself, and then you can talk. Yes, Nugusu, please.
Okay,
go
thank
ahead.
you.
Yeah.
Isaman, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. The training is very interesting. So just to take my suggestion or my comment for the training. It's very nice, and I'm interested. It's a training for that I want to take for before. So it's very interesting, and my concern is regarding the materials. So please, the coordinators, share or create a Telegram group or with some channel. Please share the materials. So this is my comment.
Yeah. Thank you for the feedback. I think that's all. Maybe I don't know if I go through the chat box. That is all the question. Maybe any concluding remark.
For my end, I'll just say thank you very much. It was really appreciated the opportunity, and it was an honor to share and facilitate this session. So yeah, very happy, and then all the best to everyone, obviously, with applying like the knowledge that we were discussing. So yeah, so in a nutshell, very happy. Thanks everyone for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you so much all for participating. We will be continuing our session tomorrow. See you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, Chris, sir, and also Zelalem for your coordination. Yeah. Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah. Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.